My dad forced me to marry the heir of a tycoon. To break off the engagement, I pretended to be a poor student and got close to that aloof and proud, seemingly inaccessible guy. I seduced him, and we had passionate, wild nights in his run-down apartment. After successfully getting pregnant, I left him some money and disappeared. But when I returned home with a baby bump to call off the engagement, the man who was supposed to have taken the money and gone abroad showed up at my house. Dressed in a sharp suit, he exuded an intimidating aura. His eyes held a possessive, almost sick look as he approached me step by step, reaching out to touch my belly. $500,000 isn't enough to buy my child. My dear fiancé. In the dim rental apartment. Moonlight cascaded over Brian's strong back. Red marks crisscrossed, a testament to our wild, intimate encounters. Bare-chested, he stood by the window, lighting a cigarette. Emma. Brian turned, smoke curling from his lips, obscuring his face. But his voice was clear, marry me. Still dazed, I heard his words, and it took a moment for them to register. I blinked slowly. What? Brian looked at me tenderly, repeating. Marry me. Will you? This time, I was fully alert. My heart pounded in terror, but I kept my composure. I beckoned to him. Brian stubbed out his cigarette and walked over. He took my hand and kissed it. I chose my words carefully. I think things are good the way they are now. Brian paused, the anticipation in his eyes quickly fading. Replaced by a dark, possessive look. He bit my index finger, as if punishing me. I winced in pain. He immediately released it, then gently suckled it, as if to soothe me. Brian, on the surface, appeared aloof, cold, and refined. But beneath that elegant facade hid a twisted, possessive nature. Luckily, his family wasn't wealthy, otherwise, it would have been truly difficult for me to get away. I pouted, starting my sob story, you know my family situation. I even took out loans for tuition. I just graduated, and I just want to work hard and earn money. Brian looked up, his gaze carrying a hint of pressure and displeasure. What about me? It seems I'm not in your plans. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly explained, of course you are. When we have money later, and buy a big house, then we can get married. Brian, I want to earn a lot of money. Only money can give me a sense of security. The persona I had created for him was that of a poor, money-loving, innocent young woman. Brian caressed my cheek, speaking slowly. What if I have a lot of money? His eyes were dark, incredibly serious. It made me hesitate for a moment. I laughed, then give me all your money, and I'll marry you. So, do you love me, or do you love money? What's wrong with Brian tonight? Why is he being so serious? I didn't want to continue this topic, so I pulled his hand, drawing him closer. Brian, I still want to. The next second, my lips were sealed. Brian was like a man possessed, my pleas and cries were useless. Finally, I passed out. In the last second before losing consciousness, I thought I heard him whisper. Why don't you love me? When I woke up the next day, it was already afternoon. My whole body ached as if it had been taken apart and reassembled. I stared at the ceiling, lying still like a corpse for a while. If this continued, Brian would eventually torture me to death. Ding dong, a message came from my dad. The Booths will be sending people over in a month. You've had enough fun running away from home these past few months, right? Get your butt back here, don't make me come get you myself. I turned off my phone, feeling a headache coming on. My dad was forcing me to marry into the Booths in G City, to marry a man I had never even met, whose name I didn't even know. No matter how much I resisted, it was useless. Desperate, I could only resort to this plan. Pretend to be a poor student and get close to Brian. Use pregnancy to force my dad to break off the engagement. I had investigated Brian's background. He was a bit arrogant, but he had no power or influence, so I wasn't worried about not being able to get away later. Besides, he was good-looking and intelligent. If I had his child, it would likely be a smart and cute baby. I placed my hand on my lower abdomen. My period seemed to be a week late. I had bought a pregnancy test before and hidden it in the bathroom and used. Exhaling, I struggled to get up and wash. Passing by the kitchen, I saw Brian cooking inside. He was turned sideways to me, stirring the soup in the pot with one hand, and holding his phone to his ear with the other. The kitchen's glass door was closed, and with the sound of the range hood, I couldn't hear what he was saying. Perhaps he saw me in his peripheral vision. Brian turned his head to look over. His eyes curved into a smile, and he made a gesture as if to open the door. I quickly waved my hand and turned to go to the bathroom. While Brian was cooking, I'd test myself first. Locking the bathroom door, I furtively took out the pregnancy test, my heart pounding with anxiety. After getting together with Brian, he had always been very careful about contraception. Several times, I had cajoled and begged him not to use a condom, but at the last moment, he always pulled out decisively. I waited anxiously for 5 minutes. 2 lines, one clear and one faint, slowly appeared on the pregnancy test. I immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Pregnant. But at the same time, it also meant that my relationship with Brian had come to an end. For some reason, I felt a little agitated. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Brian stirred the bubbling pork knuckle soup, a flippant voice coming from his phone. I say, how long are you going to keep up this poor boy act? The esteemed young master of the booths in G City, pretending to be a penniless lad to investigate the White's eldest daughter, only to have his soul snatched by some innocent-looking girl before even meeting his fiancé. Does your precious girlfriend know you have a marriage contract with the Whites? Brian's expression was calm, his tone heavy. I will break off the engagement with the Whites. His friend was shocked. No way, are you really in love? Who is this girlfriend of yours? Don't forget, the marriage contract between 2 families was arranged by our ancestors. If it could have been broken off, it would have been long ago. I heard that the White's eldest daughter tried everything, crying, making scenes, threatening suicide, to break off the engagement, but her dad still didn't agree. Brian scoffed, she wants to break off the engagement, and I want to break off the engagement. Isn't that perfect? Enough talk, I'm going to call my wife for dinner. Hey, you're already calling her wife, has she even agreed to marry you? Brian hung up the phone, his eyes darkening. She'll agree eventually. It doesn't matter if she doesn't love him. He has money, a lot of money. Loving money equals loving him. Emma, time to eat. Brian's voice came from the bathroom door. I snapped back to reality and quickly hid the pregnancy test. Coming. When I came out, Brian had already set the table. Wow, it smells amazing. When we first got together, Brian's cooking was terrible. But I couldn't cook either, so I could only force a smile and say it was delicious. Unexpectedly, his cooking skills improved by leaps and bounds, and his dishes became a feast for the senses. I pinched the fat on my little belly, troubled. I've gained weight, it's all your fault. I glared at Brian. He smiled and patted it, joking, what if there's a baby? My body tensed up involuntarily, and even my speech became hesitant. What are you talking about? You're so careful with protection. Brian didn't notice anything unusual and continued to tease. Really? How come I remember a few times? I quickly covered his mouth. If you keep talking nonsense, I'm not eating. I'll starve myself and break your heart. Brian chuckled, lovingly taking my hand down. All right, I won't say any more. After dinner, Brian cleaned up the trash in the house. Then he told me to go change clothes, so we could go out for a walk and digest. The moment I turned to go into the room, Brian's eyes darkened. When I came out dressed, he had a doting smile on his face and reached out his hand to me. Let's go. When he took my hand, he intertwined our fingers, holding me tightly. The afternoon sun wasn't scorching, and it felt warm and comfortable all over. Brian and I chatted idly. Turning the street corner, I saw a newly opened bridal shop. The wedding dress hanging in the window was exquisite. Remembering what Brian said yesterday, I couldn't help but take a couple more glances. At this moment, Brian spoke, "Let's go in and take a look." He pulled me towards the store, and I wanted to refuse. "No, let's not, we're not getting married. And we don't have money." After thinking for a moment, I opted for a different excuse. Brian smiled, "It's okay to just look. It's very beautiful, isn't it?" I nodded. Then, Brian pulled me into the store. The sales assistant carefully introduced the dresses to us. I slowly scanned the wedding gowns hanging in the main hall, my gaze falling on the mannequin in the center. An extra-long train, layered and shimmering like a meteor shower, looked so gorgeous and dazzling under the lights. "This is our signature piece, designed by the renowned designer Emma. It has a special meaning. Since it's our grand opening today, you can try it on." "Special meaning? How come I didn't know?" Brian raised an eyebrow. "Emma?" "Yes, it's the eldest daughter of the Whites, Emma. At a young age, she has won numerous design awards, and her design style is very popular among young people. But she herself is very low-key and mysterious, and few people know what she looks like. I've heard similar compliments many times, so I wasn't particularly moved. But Brian's attitude was very intriguing. He stared at the wedding dress for a moment, then let out a laugh with an unknown meaning. Let me try on this wedding dress." I quickly changed the subject. Brian paused, his eyes lighting up. "Okay, try it on." He must be thinking about marriage. Seeing the anticipation in his eyes, I actually felt a pang of reluctance. During our time together, Brian had been extremely good to me. Although he was cold at first, he was also very respectful. Later, he fell deeply in love with me, wishing he could stick to me every day. If I just left, abandoned him, would it be too cruel? I looked at Brian, somewhat lost in thought. Beside me, the sales assistant had already taken down the wedding dress for me. Brian leaned down close to me, his voice low and filled with pleasure. "What are you daydreaming about?" I snapped back to reality, "Nothing. I'll go try it on." I turned and followed the sales assistant to the fitting room. My mood was a bit complicated. The wedding dress was intricate, and it took some time to put on. The moment the curtain was pulled open, I suddenly felt very nervous and apprehensive. I almost didn't dare to look at Brian. Until the surrounding shop assistants let out gasps of admiration. Until Brian walked up to me. The familiar scent of laundry detergent wafted over, and my heart slowly calmed down. Looking up, I saw the undisguised amazement and affection in Brian's eyes. I curved my lips. "Does it look good?" Brian's Adam's apple bobbed, his gaze fixed intently on me. "Beautiful. Emma, when we get married, I'll have you wear an even more beautiful wedding dress." The deep affection and sincerity in his eyes almost drowned me. My throat tightened, and I couldn't speak for a moment. Brian beckoned, and a nearby shop assistant brought over another wedding dress. A mermaid style, understated and luxurious. "Can I try this one? I like this one." His deep voice carried a hint of pleading. I had no reason to refuse. "Okay." The mermaid gown was extremely figure-hugging, and it cinched my waist tightly. I subconsciously covered my lower abdomen. Just then, Brian pulled back the curtain and came in. I quickly put my hand down. He took the place of the sales assistant and zipped up the back of my dress. He teased, "Looks like I can't make the food too delicious next time." I played along. Exactly, I almost couldn't fit into it. Brian chuckled, standing behind me, his hands around my waist. In the mirror, Brian's tall frame completely enveloped me. His gaze lingered on me. "Emma, do you know why I chose this one?" "Why?" The possessiveness in Brian's eyes slowly revealed itself, and the hands around my waist gradually tightened, almost embedding me in his embrace. He looked at me in the mirror, a hint of madness in his eyes. A bride in a mermaid gown cannot run away from the wedding. My heart skipped a beat. Brian's hand moved forward, resting on my lower abdomen. My body instantly stiffened. Brian lowered his head, his hot breath fanning my ear. "Emma, do you like it?" I didn't know how to respond. My heart was in my throat. Does he know something? Brian didn't wait for my answer, nor did he seem to care. He continued on his own. "Do you remember when you first started chasing me? You said you liked me, it was love at first sight, and you wanted to be with me forever. Is that true, Emma?" Brian pinched my chin, making me turn my head to look at him. We looked at each other. He slowly spoke. "Then why is your gaze so calm when you look at me?" Brian was extremely close to me, afraid of missing any expression on my face. The terror in my heart could no longer be concealed. I could clearly see my guilty and scared expression reflected in his pupils. Even the air fell silent. I felt like I was having trouble breathing and subconsciously wanted to break free. Brian's arms tightened, holding me firmly in his embrace. His body was trembling. He was trying his best to restrain himself. After several deep breaths, he loosened his grip on me a little. His chin rested on my shoulder, his voice apologetic. "I'm sorry, did I scare you?" I also slowly recovered from the shock just now. "Emma, actually Brian, I want to go home." We spoke at the same time. Brian stopped halfway through his sentence. He sighed. "Okay, let's go home." On the way back, the atmosphere was not as good as when we came. We were silent, each lost in our own thoughts. I felt that I couldn't drag this on any longer. Since I was already pregnant, I should leave Brian as soon as possible. If I continued to get entangled, I was afraid I would also lose half my life. Having made up my mind, I secretly contacted my assistant. I hid in the bathroom sending messages. "Come pick me up tomorrow, then accompany me to the hospital. Also, how much accessible money do I have in my account?" Ever since I ran away from home, my dad had frozen my cards, forcing me to compromise. Assistant, not a single penny. Am I really that broke? Then lend me $500,000. I think I heard Brian mention that he had a project that required him to go abroad. $500,000 should be enough for his travel expenses. More, I don't have. Yuri's so stingy. My eyes widened. Me, stingy? I want to be generous too, but my card is frozen. My private savings have also been mostly spent during this time. Assistant, transferred. I'll pick you up at 9 tomorrow morning. I angrily turned off my phone. Outside, Brian was texting in the living room. "Come over tomorrow, do me a favor. Brian hesitated for a moment. "My girlfriend seems to be pregnant, but she seems not to want me to know. I'm going to propose. After the proposal, you and I will go to the Whites to break off the engagement. Actually, Brian had discovered the pregnancy test hidden in the bathroom a long time ago. Combined with various previous signs, he thought Emma wanted a child and wanted to marry him. Considering she had just graduated not long ago, he didn't let her have her way. But today, that pregnancy test was gone. He emptied the trash can. It wasn't in there either. Brian remembered before dinner, he had just casually teased having a baby, and Emma's stammering explanation. And at the bridal shop, when he opened the curtain, her hand that she quickly put down. Brian closed his eyes. He had wanted to wait for her to speak up. But, her eyes were resisting. Her expression was fearful. On the way back, she, who was usually chattering, was eerily quiet. This made him very panicked. Before, many times, when they weren't looking at each other, Emma's gaze was exceptionally calm. But once they made eye contact, her eyes would fill with fervent joy. He had thought this was a sign of her love for him. But now, thinking about it, it was quite the opposite. At this moment, Brian called. Brian glanced at the bathroom, got up, opened the door, and went outside. After answering, Brian's voice was calm. "This kind of thing is more suitable for James, I can't handle it. He's not as reliable as you." Brian was silent for a moment. "Are you serious?" "Yes." Brian's tone became serious. Brian, think carefully, marriage is not child's play. Emma is very outstanding. Are you sure you don't want to get to know her before directly breaking off the engagement? I heard from James that your girlfriend's family background is ordinary. There's a world of difference between you two. You wouldn't be unaware of the importance of a good family match. You like her now, perhaps it's just a fleeting fancy. What if in the future? Brian interrupted Brian. It's not a fleeting fancy. Besides, she doesn't love me. Brian was taken aback. What? Brian leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. I feel like she wants to abandon me. I want to tie her to my side. Even though Brian was trying his best to hide it, Brian could still hear the fear and humility in his tone. In the end, he could only echo James's sentiment. Who on earth is this girlfriend of yours? Brian looked up, gazing ahead, his voice softening. Family background, for her, is merely icing on the cake. She has vision, knowledge, is sophisticated, yet retains an innocent charm. If you compare her to Emma, I don't think she loses by much, she might even surpass her. Brian's tone was filled with pride. Brian clicked his tongue, hearing you say that. She doesn't sound like she came from a poor family either. Our vision and knowledge were built with real money. Since she can connect with you and you admire her, haven't you ever doubted her identity? Hearing this, Brian paused. I investigated before, there's nothing wrong with her identity. Brian, however, was not convinced. I'll fly over tomorrow morning and see who this remarkable person is. When I came out of the bathroom, Brian happened to open the door and come in. Our eyes met mid-air. Feeling guilty, I struck first. It's so late, what were you doing out? Brian closed the door, calm and composed. Taking out the trash. I glanced at the empty trash can. Didn't we take it out when we left? Brian was intentionally hiding something from me, and I also had secrets, so I didn't ask further. I tossed and turned all night. Anxious and nervous. Brian turned over and hugged me, gently patting my back. Sleep, I'm here. Don't be afraid. Slowly, sleepiness crept in. In my drowsy state, I seemed to feel Brian get up. Then, a very faint sound of a door closing. He went out. I was instantly wide awake. I looked at the time, 5 a.m. What was he doing out so early? I sat up, hesitated for a moment, and dialed my assistant's number. Plan moved up, come get me now. Whatever Brian was up to, now was the best time to leave. He was also hiding something, so he probably wouldn't be back for a while. I quickly got dressed, took out my bank card and a piece of paper, and thought for a moment. I scribbled, I've been very happy during this time. This is compensation for you. Not a word about the pregnancy. After putting it down, I stealthily opened the door, first observing my surroundings, then greased my palms and slipped away. After getting into the assistant's car, I watched her cancel Emma's identity and erase my life traces from the past few months. It was as if this was just a dream. Only Brian left a deep impression in my mind. I leaned back and exhaled. My assistant laughed at me, just a poor boy, what are you afraid of? I glanced at her, you don't understand. It's not fear. It's guilt. It's remorse. It's reluctance. I'm going to sleep for a bit, wake me up when we get to the hospital. I felt like I had just closed my eyes when my assistant started calling me. Miss, wake up, it's time to see the doctor. I struggled to open my eyes, the time showed it was already 9:30. I rubbed my eyes, let's go. The assistant had made an appointment in advance, so there was no need to wait in line. They did a blood test, confirmed I was pregnant, exactly 4 weeks along. All the data was good, just needed regular prenatal checkups later. When I came out with the report, the assistant asked me, are you going home? I shook my head, focus on the pregnancy first. It's only been a month, the pregnancy isn't very stable yet. If my dad found out, what if he insisted I get an abortion? Hearing this, the assistant was somewhat surprised. You're not going to give birth, are you? I turned to look at her. If I'm not giving birth to her, why would I get pregnant with her? The assistant's eyes widened. Huh? I thought you just wanted to use the pregnancy to break off the engagement. You're really going to give birth? I nodded. Of course. I carefully selected the baby's father. My family is prominent and wealthy. We can surely afford to raise one child. That's true. So where are you staying now? I didn't speak, just looked at the assistant. She pointed to herself, looking both exasperated and helpless. Fine, when you go back, if you don't give me a raise, you just wait. Raise, definitely a raise. Let's go, I'm really tired and hungry. In the rental apartment. Brian, dressed in a black suit, looked composed, profound, and unspeakably noble. Even his hair was meticulously styled. It was clear he attached great importance to this. And the room was empty. The furnishings hadn't changed, clothes and daily necessities were still there. At first, he thought Emma had gone out. He wanted to call her back and give her a surprise. However, a card and a note were conspicuously placed on the table. Brian pinched the thin piece of paper, looking at the words on it, his knuckles white from the force. I've been very happy during this time. This is compensation for you. The bank card lay quietly on the table, as if mocking his unrequited affection. He had arranged everything last night, so excited he couldn't sleep, looking forward to Emma's reaction when she found out his identity today. He didn't trust others, so he personally supervised them setting up the proposal scene and called his best friend over. But what was the result? Emma really gave him a big surprise. Brian glanced at the note and tooted, "What did I say last night?" James leaned over, his expression exaggerated. "Brian, you've been tricked out of your body and heart. Good thing I came along, otherwise such a good show." Brian shot him a glare, and James instantly fell silent. The pressure around Brian was extremely low. The bouquet in his hand was already crushed out of shape. His hand loosened, and the flowers fell to the ground. "I'd like to see who she really is." Brian's eyes churned with ferocity. It was the first time in his life he had been played like this. Beyond the anger, there was also sadness. Sure enough, his premonition was correct. She wanted to abandon him. Emma, you just wait. But after some investigation, this Emma person had vanished into thin air. As if she had never existed. Brian's face grew darker and darker. Brian mused, her name is just one different from your fiancé's. Haven't you ever suspected? Of course, he had suspected. But he had investigated, and there was nothing unusual. Brian took a deep breath, gritting his teeth. Go to the Whites. Brian visited the Whites. He didn't alarm Mr. White, just said he was coming to see them. He stayed at her home for 2 days and confirmed Emma's identity. Brian was so angry he laughed, gritting his teeth. Emma, good, very good. You were too lazy to even come up with a fake name to trick me, weren't you? Brian suppressed a laugh. The Whites is one of the top prominent families in Capital City. If they intentionally hid her, it's normal that you couldn't find out. She didn't know your identity either, did she? Brian came from G City and intentionally disguised himself, so naturally, Emma couldn't find out either. These two were really a perfect match. Knowing Emma's identity made investigating the subsequent matters much smoother. The more Brian investigated, the darker his face became. Emma hid her identity to get pregnant and break off the engagement. What if she hadn't chosen him? Would she treat others the same way? Just thinking about it made Brian feel like he was going to explode with anger. Originally, he only thought she had hidden the pregnancy. He never imagined there was this layer to it. All these things, one after another, he really had to teach her a lesson. Where is Emma now? Living at her assistant's place, focusing on her pregnancy. Hearing the words focusing on her pregnancy, Brian's tightly furrowed brow relaxed slightly. Help me schedule a meeting with Mr. White. Emma, it's time to come home. I had only been free for a few days when my dad started bombarding me with messages, urging me to go back. He said the young master of the booths had come personally and specifically asked to see me. If I didn't go back soon, he would come and get me himself. I touched my belly, holding the pregnancy test report, and slowly went home. As soon as I stepped into the White's main entrance, I saw my dad smiling so hard his face was full of wrinkles. I deliberately held my stomach and walked over. Dad. The moment my dad saw me, the wrinkles instantly smoothed out. He put down his teacup and put on a stern face. You finally decided to come back. Didn't you ask me to come back? My dad glared at me, his gaze lingering on my stomach for a moment. What? Don't tell me you're pregnant and want to break off the engagement. My dad stood up, took my hand, and said earnestly. Emma, you're grown up now. You should know that as the eldest daughter of the Whites, your marriage is not up to you to decide. You want love, but how can love be as solid as benefits? Now that the Booths is becoming more and more prominent in G City, your marriage can strengthen the relationship between our two families and develop the Whites' connections and resources in G City. This is a win-win situation. Dad knows you're angry, and I've let you make a fuss during this time, but when it comes to a critical moment, Dad hopes you can see the bigger picture. After listening, I slowly pulled my hand away. Is that so? You and Mom are also a hub of benefits. If it's so solid, how did I end up with a younger brother? Is it for the mutual benefit of the Whites, or to pave the way for my stupid younger brother? Does he really think I don't understand anything? Hearing this, my dad's expression twisted slightly. Just as he was about to get angry, a man came out of the second-floor bathroom. Uncle. This voice. I froze instantly. I looked up in disbelief. At the top of the stairs, Brian stood in a suit, exuding an intimidating aura. He walked at a measured pace. Uncle, I'd like to have a private chat with Emma. My dad glanced at me, snatched the pregnancy report from my hand, crumpled it up, and threw it into the trash can. Even after my dad left, I still hadn't processed what was happening. Isn't Brian a penniless guy? Was my investigation wrong? Only Brian and I were left in the huge living room. At this moment, Brian had already revealed his true colors. His eyes held a possessive, almost sick look as he approached me step by step, reaching out to touch my belly. His voice was icy. $500,000 isn't enough to buy my child. My dear fiancé. I stumbled back a few steps. Brian grabbed me, swept me into his arms bridal style, and went straight to his room. His strength was so great I couldn't break free. Brian, calm down. This is my house. Brian pressed me onto the bed, covering my mouth. His eyes were dark and turbulent. Emma. Don't you have anything to say to me? His tone was harsh. If you wanted to borrow a stud, you should have just said so. I would have come with a snap of your fingers. Why go through all this trouble, lying that you love me, and even condescending to live with me in that shabby rental apartment? You've really been wronged, Emma. His voice suddenly rose, hiding a barely perceptible anger and grievance. I was both scared and guilty. Knowing I was in the wrong, I tried hard to find a way to soothe his emotions. But with my mouth covered, I couldn't make a sound. I could only grab Brian's other hand and guide it to my belly. There's a baby, don't scare her. Brian stiffened. His eyes quickly reddened. His body trembled uncontrollably. Emma, you were the one who said you loved me, you were the one who seduced me, you were the one who made me fall for you step by step. How could you abandon me? Brian's voice was low, filled with endless grievance, making one's heart ache for no reason. That day, I was planning to propose to you. I originally thought you were just hiding the pregnancy from me. You like money, I have lots and lots of money, I can keep you by my side for a lifetime. But, you left, you just left like that. Brian's head drooped onto my shoulder, his breathing heavy. Why don't you love me, even a little bit? Just a little bit. There was a hint of a sob in his voice. After a long while, Brian's emotions calmed down a bit. I took his hand away, and before I could speak, he apologized in a muffled voice. I'm sorry, Emma. I didn't mean to deceive you. I originally wanted to assess my fiancé, but I didn't expect to meet you first and fall in love with you first. Since that's the case, can we just call it even? Brian nuzzled my nose with his tone pleading. Emma, I know you don't like me like this. I won't do it again in the future. I was so scared, I was afraid you would leave me. Heaven knows how he got through those few days. Guarding the empty room, yet full of her traces, every second felt like a year, an extreme torment. Will you leave me? After only a 2-second silence, he pressed, Emma, will you leave me? Don't treat me like that, okay? His voice trembled slightly. He lowered his head to find my lips and bit down hard. Answer me. Emma. It hurt a lot. Brian. Brian obediently stopped, his eyes moist as he looked at me. Can I speak now? He hadn't given me a chance to speak at all just now. Brian pursed his lips. Can you say what I want to hear? I gently pushed Brian. His body stiffened, and he got up, looking aggrieved and helpless. I sat up and remained silent for a while. Beside me, Brian stared intently, emotions churning in his eyes. He lifted his hand, then lowered it again, clenching it into a fist. The moment I saw Brian just now, a lot of thoughts ran through my mind. I thought he would expose me, retaliate against me, hate me. But it seemed, he loved me even more. I turned my head. Brian. Brian looked at me nervously. I softened my voice. Actually, I quite liked what you did just now. I was always a little scared before. Afraid that if he went crazy, he wouldn't care about anything and would hurt me. But now it seems, he wouldn't. Even when he was very angry, he only bit my lip. And he kept trying to explain himself. Hearing this, Brian's eyes lit up, and he eagerly grabbed my hand. Emma. Brian suddenly hugged me. But. His whole body stiffened. I continued, I can't marry you right now. Why? This family fortune, I have to fight for it. I also received training from my dad when I was young. He cultivated my ambition, but then a younger brother suddenly appeared, and he wouldn't even let me compete with him. Now he wants to marry me off to G City, partly to pave the way for Jason, and partly to prevent me from fighting him for the family inheritance. But I insist on fighting. This rightfully belongs to me. He and my mother were married for decades. He might say it was a loveless business marriage, but there was always a certain decorum, no messy illegitimate children. But Jason and I are only 3 years apart. In the end, he even brazenly brought Jason back. It was Jason who came to take my things. I looked at Brian. Just a glance, and he knew what I wanted to do. Brian raised an eyebrow. Want to use me? I snuggled up to him to please him. Fiancé. Brian. Help me, please. I rubbed my head against his chest. Brian suddenly pressed me down, taking a deep breath. All right, stop rubbing. I tilted my head up, watching his gaze gradually darken. The next second, Brian kissed me. Restrained yet turbulent. My patience isn't very good. I can't wait too long, Emma. 1 year, just 1 year will be fine. Once Jason is out of the picture, it'll just be me. By then, the baby will have been born, and you can wear a wedding dress. Brian kissed my forehead. You just know how to say sweet things to coax me. I'll only give you 1 year. After 1 year, even if I have to tie you up, I'll drag you to get married. Saying that, Brian gave me a box. All my assets are in here. I was shocked, remembering the words I had carelessly said before. Give me all your money, and I'll marry you. He took it seriously. My eyes started to water a little. Brian, be careful I don't trick you out of everything you own, down to your last pair of underwear. Brian smiled, looking at me dotingly. You've already tricked me once. Do you have the heart to trick me a second time? A year passed in the blink of an eye. With Brian's help, my plan went smoothly. After several projects Jason was in charge of ran into trouble, he himself suffered the consequences and was sentenced. Although my dad managed to bail him out, he was pretty much finished. He couldn't take it and tried to settle scores with me. At that time, I was in the hospital giving birth, and Brian was by my side. With Brian there, Jason didn't succeed. It wasn't until after I gave birth that I found out Brian had put pressure on him and sent Jason abroad. Brian poked our daughter's soft cheek and kissed my forehead. There was only heartache in his eyes. "Emma, I'm sorry." I chuckled. "I wanted the child, what does it have to do with you?" My parents' unhappy marriage made me resistant to arranged marriages. When breaking off the engagement failed back then, I had already thought it through. Find a man with good genes, have a smart baby, not only could I break off the engagement, but I would also have company. Who knew that after looking around, I set my sights on Brian. Luckily, it was Brian. Brian and I got our marriage license first. I recuperated for half a year, and he prepared for half a year before the wedding ceremony was held. Looking at the dazzling wedding dress, I was a little surprised. It wasn't a mermaid gown. Brian hugged me from behind, his tone reverent. "I won't tie you down, Emma. I want you to be willing." I turned around and hugged him, nodding. "Yes. I do."